Hello, everybody. Good morning. Well, morning my time. Welcome to the stream. And looks like I already have some folks showing up here, so great. Decided to change it up and move it to a Monday today. See if I might get some different guests and just kind of move it around so people can make these on occasion. Old Geek, Mage's Musings, Echo. Welcome, welcome, welcome. According to YouTube, oh, and there's a grumpy old slan has arrived. According to YouTube, I have, uh, and so yeah, that's kind of cool. And I saw Geek say he was going to be in and out a bit while he's doing real life stuff, which is totally cool. I get that. All right, so hope everybody is having a good day today. I did an impromptu stream yesterday for about an hour just talking about my love of superhero gaming and why I think that it is the easiest gaming genre to run and probably one of the easiest to have fun in. Um, but basically, yeah, I mean, it's if you want to hear what I had to say, you can go ahead and pick that up. It's in the saved videos. All right, so today we are talking about, or I am talking about, the Um, basically breaking the mold for for Tolkien. And nothing against Tolkien. I mean, let me get that out of the way. This is just if you were looking to make your um your demi-humans and stuff less like Tolkien, what can you do? What has been done? And of course, I'm not aware of everything that's been done out there. But yeah, there's lots of ways to do it. But it seems like in a lot of cases, especially within gaming, there's this tendency to default back to the kind of standard Tolkien or Tolkien-esque standard for elves, halflings, dwarves. Um, and I mean, halflings makes total sense because those are pretty much unique in regard to their particular interpretation to Tolkien, even though similar folk have existed in folklore, but those are also sort of interchangeable with a gnome or a dwarf in some instances, and I mean to a degree, so are elves. So we're gonna park all of the folkloric variables and get maybe touch on those later. Let's see. Yeah, this is pretty much the default. Um, the arrogant and aloof supermodels of the RPG world. Um, and sorry, I was distracted by another message. Uh, but yeah, do they have to be that way? No. And there have been various attempts in RPGs that I am aware of that I've had firsthand knowledge of uh, in experience. Um, and those are the ones I'm going to start with. And so at any point during the stream, if you have a question or a comment, by all means, make it. And I'll be happy to pull it up here and take a look at it and speak to that. But here we go. We're going to start with elves. So with elves, I feel that first of all, breaking this arrogant and aloof bit is harder to do than their physical appearance and their physical and just their presence. The arrogant and aloof kind of seems to fit every version of elves, and if you don't put that in there, they just sort of feel um, strange. Now, it has been done in different ways. I know, for example, if you look at um, Athos, Dark Sun, um, uh, they they made their elves a little bit different, but I feel like they still had that sort of, while they weren't arrogant and aloof, they were still like distant and wandering and kind of detached. Hey, squirrel, welcome, welcome, welcome. Um, so we will see you later then, I guess. But thanks for stopping in. And then, of course, when you get to the the elves in, say, like Dragon Prince, they are very much depicted still with the arrogance and the aloofness, but now they're very much keyed in towards the elements, and so that then kind of feeds into their different sub races and stuff. All right, so I'm going to pull up an image here if I can get StreamYards to do what I want it to do, because that is a thing. And we'll start with, where is it? Real quick. All right, so we got some images here. Here are the elves from from Dragon Prince, and or at least some of them. And so Dragon Prince has gone ahead and kept the pointy ears and kept the general humanoid form. However, it has given them horns, and which is cool because it kind of gives them sort of satyrish horns, and their morphology does tend to change based on what element they're associated with. So they've got the earthy ones have bigger horns and are more satyr-like in general in their demeanor. They have some flying ones, which is cool. And these guys, I think they did a really great job in this series of creating elves that are still recognizable as elves, but um, are unique enough to not be considered Tolkien elves. We have moon elves, and they are actually their magical powers ebb and flow based on the phase of the moon. You have the kind of earthy war elves who are all about the power of this. You've got the sun elves, and they have fire based powers, and it's very cool. I like the way that they broke it down. And then we have, here is an image of a dark sun elf. And now these images may be kind of small, and I apologize. They weren't wanting to blow up without looking grainy and stupid. But they're depicted very much as like the striders of the desert in Dark Sun, and they kind of play up to that. So that's always fun. Let's see. So mages play elves as playful and frivolous, though those minimal with minimal contact, and other races who lack comprehension about the race's ways. And that's a way to do it too. I think that leans a little bit more into the folkloric elf, which is a way to do it as well. And I do like that as well. And I'll kind of get to some other interpretations where you can kind of lean into folklore as well. And I think it's kind of funny. D&D itself recognized this. We've seen the elves of uh, Dark Sun here, but also even earlier, the Drow are very much kind of a departure from the typical Tolkien elf. They still have that aloofness and that arrogance, but they are now depicted as, depending on at what point you start following them, sort of eldritch and dark evil weirdness, or going on to being basically out and out just crazy religious fanatics, um, and of a much more vile bent. And so that, I think that's where we see our first, or one of our, some of our earliest departures from the Tolkienesque elf. So yeah, those were good, and I did like those. Yeah, see. um, so it's funny because I the the drow kind of predate the goth subculture, and I never really felt that the drow really fed into that all that all that well. They definitely changed over time. um they, as far as I understand it, they are based on the Dachelfar from Nordic mythology, at least in the general context of being the context um, the context of being the dark counterpart to the light elves. And then the name actually, it was from the article I read, was taken from the Cornish trow or tro, depending on how you pronounce it, and they just put a D at the beginning. Um, well, if we're talking about actual goths, no. Goth subculture, probably, maybe. I mean, I guess what I'm talking about, maybe like the pop cultural goth movement that was very popular. Yes, I know that goth styling kind of goes back way back into the Victorian era and even before. But I think when folks are referring to goths, if they're not talking about you know Northern European barbarians, they're talking about the modern day goth subculture, or at least I would assume so. Uh, yeah, I mean, so goth subculture comes out of the generally is considered to have come out of the punk and new wave movements, and so yeah, I guess seeing as those both come out in sort of the 70s and 80s, so yeah. But again, I don't feel like the drow as originally depicted really fed much into that. If anything, they were much more of the stereotypical black hat, white hat, good and evil, um, and really designed to completely contrast everything that D&D presented about the other elves. At least that's how I saw it. And my phone is deciding to go crazy, so let me silence that real quick. Sorry for the interruption. I had a delivery this morning that I needed to know when exactly it arrived, and so I needed to be able to hear my phone. All right, so that's enough about the drow. So then we also have this moment in time. If anybody was around in the 80s playing D&D, we remember or had access to Dragon magazines or other gaming periodicals, you may have seen this line of role-playing stuff released with the tagline of "No elves," and that was kind of tongue-in-cheek. Um, and it's so sorry. It's been a bit of a morning. So yeah, I doubt. Yeah, goth influence in Lake Geneva, probably not at that time. No, but so Talislanta, when it came out, used the tagline, the advertising line of "No elves," and that is true in name alone. The game was full of tall, lithe, pointy-eared, magical folk of various forms. They also had shorter, pointy-eared magical folk of various forms. So they had very much had iterations of what we would consider an elf, but it wasn't called an elf. And they had some cultural differences, and but they were definitely there. It's a great world. Uh, I've played in it a few times. It's almost an overload of options considering all the different races that all have their place there. But yeah, so this was another one where we had a good amount of uh, elven variation. Uh, and so, you know, those are the ones I have had direct experience with. I know that, for example, Dragonlance had its elves, but I never felt like its elves really departed from Tolkien's version all that much. They may have given them different names than High Elf, Wood Elf, Gray Elf, um, but that was just because they decided to give them linguistic notes, which was fun. So you had the Kaganesti, Darganesti, Quellenesti, and all that stuff. And then, I mean, even Forgotten Realms um, has that name change for those things where they have, they give their elves different names. I believe like golden elves and all of that. Um, and then Greyhawk had some variations that broke out of that mold, but I don't think they ever went all that far. I think the biggest departure besides Drow were probably with the Grugach or Grugach or however you want to pronounce it. Um, and they were still kind of wood elfy, but it's clear that whoever wrote them really was leaning in on the Sami reindeer people from Finland, um, because it's there. Even the illustrations in the Dragon magazine that covered them were clearly poached or inspired from by that regional culture. So let's see. Yeah, it's we have I mean it so with the elves there were some other iterations that weren't quite Tolkienesque as well that I remember. Rolaids actually had a pretty good coverage of ice elves in their elves book, which while they were still sort of just that, you know, climatic variation elf concept like sea elves, um, and but they were something that I don't think we really see too much specifically in Tolkien. All right, so moving on from elves, we have also um, we have halflings. Halflings have most of the variations in halflings have been stepping away from the Tolkien mold of the homebody. And as this picture shows here, I mean, they have been moved into, as early as AD&D, having um, other concepts that were much less homey to where, a halfling paladin or a halfling cavalier or whatever subclass they created for them, or, class variant they created for them was a thing. And I think it's a cool way to do it. And this is exactly right. I mean, they are halflings. Their halflings are Tolkien in everything but name. And we, anybody who knows the history of that, they were originally even called hobbits. But then somebody told them he couldn't. So, and that somebody was the Tolkien people. So, um, but then we also have amongst the most notable um, variations on halflings, we have the Kender. And somewhere in here, I have a picture of a Kender. But if you don't know what a Kender is, you know, they are very much and I seem to have lost my picture of the Kender. Oh well. The Kender are halfling-ish, um, but and this is a good point too. Tolkien refers to hobbits as halflings, and I know like the orcs tended to call them halflings. Um, the Harfoots, that's true. And although grumpy, the Harfoots, I think they are supposed to be um, um, I mean, you can like love it or leave it, like the series, whatever. Um, I think they did a good job of working with what they have and extrapolating on the world to create uh, their own stories. Um, and honestly, if you can live in a world where we role play in the Lord of the Rings and create our own stories, then I think it's okay to have TV shows and books that do the same thing. But the Harfoots were very much depicted as sort of a proto halfling, I believe. And I think that's what we're really seeing them as, is that these are the halflings before they settled down and became stuff. Exactly. Um, um, yeah, I mean, so unfortunately, poor writing and fantasy go hand in hand. There's very few fantasy movies that are actually written well. There are some that are written so badly that they just become good and good, and then there are like high productions like Rings of Power, where the writing is such a stark contrast to like the visual production and in some cases even the acting that it really stands out. I mean, I enjoyed Rings of Power, but I am also not somebody who gets married to um, canonicity or gets overly bogged down in what is the perfect iteration of something. But that's not what we're here to talk about. um, let's see. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, if you don't like them, you don't like them. Like what you like. I think halflings as portrayed in early D&D made sense in early D&D. Later D&D, they become kind of hard to reconcile with the style of adventure that's going on in later editions. It's, having homebodies that don't want to go do anything um, doesn't make well for adventurers. Um, but again, I have made halflings into other things in my games. In one of my campaigns, the halflings were much more like uh, Romany people, and you know they actually lived in houseboats and went and traveled the rivers of the campaign setting. Instead of traveling land in big wagons, they traveled the rivers, and any riverside town often had a little collection of them there, and you could go to these river folk and you know have uh, untoward uh, business if you needed to get your fortunes told and all of that. So they were very, but yeah, that's what we're here to talk about is variations on halflings. And so, you know, Tolkien may have invented them, but I think there's still room for iteration and interpretation. Let's see. Not going to argue that one. I mean, it may not be Middle Earth per se, but then again, Middle Earth under Tolkien wasn't even consistent. So, uh, let's see. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, if you're playing and this is something that's lost in newer editions of the game, where they're trying to make them much more broad, and there's not as much of an implied setting. A world should have specifics, otherwise it doesn't feel like a place. I do think that if you were running a big enough D&D game, it's reasonable to have halflings that may be different in different places. For example, in my world with the halflings who are living as kind of, gypsy, I know that's not a popular word or even a PC word anymore, but as gypsy river folk, they weren't the only halflings. Regular halflings existed as well, regular halflings who lived in shires and stuff. But if you're talking about wide swaths of land and regional variations, I think it's easy enough to put those into your games and still have it feel great. Um, was starting to talk about Kender, and I think I don't understand Kender hate. I'm pretty sure Kender hate comes from the way people play them and not because of what they are. Kender are actually a pretty unique and interesting iteration on halflings. In my opinion, they're a good variation. Now, according to the canon of Dragonlance, they're actually related to gnomes and not halflings. But I think it's very clear that they were intended to fill the halfling mold. Not only are there no halflings in Athos, not Athos, excuse me, um, Dragonlance. Um, and I know it's world Kryn. There's the word I was looking for. Kryn doesn't have them. Um, but yeah, I liked them. I thought that culturally they wrote an interesting concept into them as having no the whole no concept of personal possession. The way that people played them, I think, is what made people hate them. And of course, Dark Sun halflings are a bunch of raging cannibals, um, and who can't get behind the idea of cannibal halflings. That just sounds fun. Let's see. So that is the, that's just bad art direction because that's not consistent through third edition. Um, and later editions, yes, they were often depicted as wearing boots, um, but they were also still shown as not wearing boots. And it kind of goes to that generic fantasy thing where you don't want to ever depict anything as one way because it's you want to leave it up to the players. All right. Let's see. And this isn't it. Yeah, this is the point I was trying to make. I feel that Tolkien did a good job of writing this because even his elves of the same folk are slightly different in different places. They may not look different, but they have different attitudes and different outlooks. Yeah, the PvP aspect of stealing from one's allies is verboten. That is good. It's if your group can play around with that, I think you're in a win-win. Because it allows the Kender player to play it up and it allows everybody to be in there for yucks. Where I think the failing on that is a couple of things. The general perception that stealing from the party is bad, and basically anything PvP is bad, but also people not being good sports or people other players trying to do sneaky things, and rather than kind of telegraphing or narrating their actions. I find a lot of the PvP goes um, goes away when you can frame your character's actions with narrative statements that make it clear that it's the character doing it and also their motivations. Like if I just sit there and say I steal your sword out of your saddlebag, that's kind of a dick move. Um, However, if I sit there and say, while Brandon the Cavalier is off, packing up his bedrolls and stuff, my Kender's going to wander over and look around at what's on his horse, and he thinks that his short sword looks neat, and so he's going to go ahead and take it. Those are very different things, and I think they frame it differently. And the Cavalier player is going to see that, and knowing you're playing a Kender, he's going to be like, hopefully he's going to smile and be up, kind of, able to play it off. There's if the Kender guy is handing the DM a note that says I'm stealing the Cavalier's sword when he's not looking, and then we get into the fight, and I mean, in the scenario I presented, the Cavalier could also follow back with, you know, he returns back to his horse and sees that his sword is going, and then looks at the Kender and goes, "All right, hand it over." You know, it allows everybody to play in on the fun. Let's see. Yeah, and I think the codification of my character steals from even from other PCs was taken too literally by some. Um, it's I mean, in modern context, it gets hate for the monoculture concept. However, at the same time, this could be written in a way that sounds very culturally decent. Um, as an example, and truth or not, I often see all kinds of stuff about how Native Americans didn't have concepts of property, and da 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 da. Da. I don't buy it. Personal property and personal possession is a thing. I guess I get that marginal or small band societies have different concepts of possession, but again, fantasies also tend to be reality turned up to 11, and so I think it's a fair cop to say that the race as a whole may not have this concept, and amongst their people it's just share and share alike, that then gets translated when they're out amongst other folk as you know stealing. And this is one of the problems I had when Wizards tried to update the Kender. They were so afraid of that context that they had the Kender pockets thing. They tried to write it out as some sort of magical connection to the Feywild. Um, and they backed off on that. But it would have been really easy for them to write a nice, and this I mentioned it to my brother yesterday when we were doing some yard work over his house and we were talking. Seems like every time Wizards goes to fix something, they do it the absolute easiest, laziest way they can, and often end up producing a result that is worse than it needs to be, and needlessly milky, because with the Kender they could have easily written in there's this, hey, they have this lovely culture where they're share and share alike, and the idea of individual possession is kind of a foreign concept to them. This causes them problems when they're out and amongst folk, but that's because they're culturally misunderstood, not because they're a bunch of kleptos. um you know and it's again lazy iterations and uh path of least resistance creativity. Let's see. Let's see. Um, Good suggestion there from Grumpy on a culture um, with no property. Not read it, but now I will put it on my list. Yeah, I did see that recently, and the concept of character versus character is something I believe in. I think I've done away with secret squirrel notes at the table for my games, and I feel that unless they're absolutely important, they have really no place at the gaming table, because they tend to cause more problems than they create fun. Um, Also, when the other players are in on the secrets, they can play off of them and kind of improve the experience of the secret holder. Like if your character is secretly wanted by a kingdom and you're playing it without anybody knowing, then you're doing a lot of edge lord lone wolfy crap, and they don't know. Um, and then if everybody knows, however, they can play up on that. They're like, you know, oh, I hope there's none of these here. And even if their characters don't know, like they can, it creates some dramatic moments. And yeah, I get paranoia. I've never been a huge fan of it, probably because I don't like wackadoo slapstick RPGs and the paranoia. Now, I mean, if you're playing a World of Darkness games, I feel that maybe there's like a lot of room for that because it just feeds into the setting. So, the third Tolkien race that we can really talk about is the uh, the dwarf, and unfortunately, I also seem to have lost my image that I had for the dwarf queued up, but dwarves are always dwarves in almost every fantasy world of the race they're in. They seem to almost always be the same. The window dressing may be different, and the accent may change may change based on who's running them. I've actually started to see a couple of um, things with people using Russian accents for them instead of Scottish accents. But um, yeah, this, I mean, they can be if you want them to be. It's your game. Um, but and I know, like, for example, like Dark Sun just made them short little tough guys. Um, Dragonlance, they were still just dwarves. And yes, Kingdom of the Dwarves will be mentioned because it's great. But even in that book, they are still classic dwarves. Although it show what dwarves were like around the world, and they were different. Like they showed Egyptian dwarves and all of that. Um, some cool ways to do variations on dwarves that I have seen um, kind of pull from. I mean, D&D's already done it a couple of times. Like they have elemental dwarves with the fire dwarves. Uh, let's see. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you go with the accents, um, and you go with the voices that you know. I mean, that for whatever reason, orcs when they through their snarly, tusky voices also tend to be kind of Cockney. So I don't know why that is. Yeah, but um, and but yeah, I think when you're talking about creating. When you're talking about moving away from these core concepts of the Tolkien versions, you really only have so many axes to go on, and there's also the problem with any fantasy race is they are kind of a big elastic band. You can stretch them only so far before they break and then are no longer recognizable for what they're supposed to be. um, which because fantasy tends to be kind of archetypical, um, you kind of want to avoid that. Now, that's not to say you can't have a game world where you don't have any of the recognizable races. That certainly works. I mean, I know. If you look at Narnia, right? We got a bunch of talking animals and some of the fantasy races, but we don't, and we do have dwarves and stuff like that in there. But you know, that's a world that kind of doesn't lean on dwarves and elves as much as it does other stuff. Um, just here, and so you only can take your ideas so far before they stop looking like what they are. These images I'm going to pull up here are some ideas I've used in the past for elves. Um, when I was doing the elves for the Gnarlwood um, Gnarlwood? Good lord, I don't even know that. I can't even remember the forest in my own campaign world. Blackhorn Forest, Gnarlwood is a different one. But the Blackhorn Forest in my campaign world, they are elves, but they are dark elves, but they are not drow. They live in an enchanted forest that is so dark that even during daylight, it's only as bright as dusk. Um, there is at night, fairy fire kind of dances around in the under the canopy. And so when I was looking through that, looking for images to represent those, I found a lot of dark, foreboding, haunting images like these that kind of spoke to that concept. Now, the last two on here, I mean, could be anything but elves, and but this one here really kind of goes for what I was looking for, although I didn't go with the giant ears. Um, but yeah, so I mean, it's still an elf. It is not your typical pretty elf, even though it's still got those fine features. Um, but yeah, it's clearly an elf. Let's see, Grumpy for inspiration on different races. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely no shortage of other races out there. Creating other races is um not so much the tricky part. It's the iteration of known races that are kind of trickier. I mean, you can take it so far um as um one thing you can do is you can actually when you're talking about changing them for game purposes. I did an experiment, just kind of thought experiment, where I shuffled the roles. So dwarves are generally the miners and craftsmen, and then elves are the magical folk, um, and then halflings, gnomes, and all that. And so what I did is I changed their roles. I made the elves the people in the mountains, hidden from man, um, you know, crafting their fine crafted weapons, and then the dwarves became these sort of stoic, um, you know, aloof, hidden magic folk. Um, which kind of makes them run into the concept of gnomes, but in that case, I also made the dwarves focus on different elements. So you had like the earth dwarves and fire dwarves and air dwarves and stuff like that. So very kind of last airbender-ish. But um you can do that. You can also run these roles and completely change the aesthetic. I ran a campaign once where I am traditionally not a fan of gnomes. Um kind of I've sort of dialed back on that, but for the longest time, I wasn't a really huge fan of gnomes or half orcs or half species for the longest time as well. And so I had a campaign setting where I decided I didn't want to take those player options out of the game, so I reskinned them as other things. So gnomes became Hergens, um, which are little hedgehog folks. And then um, halflings actually got replaced in that setting by mouse folk, um, which was fun. And then for half orcs, I turned them into a race of humans that had giant blood, um, called the half gear. And then instead of half elves, we had changeling humans who were humans who had been taken by the Fae and were Fae touched, and that's how they got their elfy abilities, but still kind of had that one foot in two worlds kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, the idea of taking the concepts and moving them outside of the Tolkien mold is not new. It's not unique. It's not hard. The key thing you just have to remember is to um, not push them so far that they stop being what you wanted them to be, um, or what they're supposed to be. If they're not, if you're bothering to put elves in your game and they're unrecognizable as elves, then you don't have elves. You have something else. Um, and that something else may fill the role of an elf, but it's not an elf anymore. Um, I so not a game. Well, I guess it is a game because they made an RPG about it. But the old ElfQuest comic was an interesting twist on elves, and it had elves across the spectrum of ideas and and societies, because in that setting the elves had scattered to the world and adapted to different environments. So you had sort of aloof high elfy kinds, and then you had sort of more rustic village dwelling elves, and you had wild beast riding elves who actually had wolf blood, because one of their ancestors had shapeshifted into a wolf, um, to help their ancestors survive, and she ended up being in a wolf form so long that she ended up having you know a baby by a wolf, and that that descendant was the first kind of wolf elf hybrid, and then as the generations went down, the wolfiness, kind of diminished, but it was still in there. But yeah, I mean, you can play with it as much as you want, and the roles that they fill. It's really mechanically, it's the roles that they fill. So, that's not so much what I'm talking about. I mean, if you look at Star Frontiers, for example, you can kind of squint and see that they have a sort of a standard mix of D&D fantasy races in Star Frontiers. They've got humans, and then they've got Dralosites, which are kind of like dwarves. You've got Vrusk, which sort of fill that aloof alien mindset, except for in their case, they're like logical and business minded. But they're sort of the elves. And then you have the Azerians, who are kind of like your half orcs. They're the brutal fighter type characters. They're the more savage race. But it's still that typical cross section of uh, player races. And then, of course, as that game expanded, they got some more races and stuff that sort of filled other roles, including just straight up space dwarves, which was lame. Zebulon's Guide sucks. But so yeah, as far as other ways to iterate, what I'm going to do now is, so we've reached about the first hour of the stream, and if anybody would like to jump in and hang out, I'm going to throw up the link here. Go ahead and put out a request, and when you come onto the stream and talk with me, if you can. If not, otherwise we're good. But yeah, let's see. I'll even highlight that up here. There is the link. So go ahead and join me if you want. Yeah, it's elf. I think the elf analog does fit the aliens, the alien concept really well. Actually, back to ElfQuest, the punchline at the end of the ElfQuest saga is that you have been reading science fiction the whole time and not fantasy. And looks like I may have a puppet mage coming in just a moment. Hello, sir. Welcome to the stream.
Hello, hello.
Hey, hey. So
I'm playing hooky.
You're playing
procrastinating
hooky?
From work.
Oh, that's fine. It's my day off, and I decided to come down here and do the morning stream. How are you doing?
I'm okay. It was a groggy morning this morning, I think. I got the notice that, right, Eli's stream is on. I better get on that.
Yeah, I'm still trying to feel it out and figure out where it sits, and it may just bounce back and forth between Sundays and Mondays, just to kind of give different folks a chance to get in on one of them or another. Like if I put it on Sundays, I'm never going to get the dungeon minister. All right, okay.
Right.
But so interpreting demi-human races away from the Tolkien vibe.
Yeah, I never. Well, I tend to sort of skew to whatever rule book is being presented. And Tolkien, playing them as Tolkien never even entered my mind, even back in the day. Well, especially back in the day when, at age 13, I had only ever read The Hobbit.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I've always been a homebrew GM, and so for me, I've never been attached all that much to the worlds as written. That's as much out of necessity because I was often poor and couldn't afford to buy stuff, but I also the way I came into the hobby was very creationist, and just wanted to. So it's always been a thing for me to iterate and interpret and recreate the races. That's not to say there's nothing wrong. I mean, there is nothing wrong, I should say, with running them as they are in the books. I think there's a lot of nuance in how they're written in the games that a lot of people don't play with, and that's unfortunate. Like
Mhm.
if you read about the elves in D&D, most people don't play them that way.
No, absolutely not. Well, the term humans with funny hats comes up a lot, which is very true.
Yeah, and I think
People,
that's unfortunately how most people play anything. You know,
but to be fair, the idea of analyzing a character and stepping outside of yourself is a skill that has to be learned. Not everybody can do it.
absolutely. Um, and so it's looks like we may even be getting a geek. Hello, sir.
Hello.
Hello,
Sort
hello,
of
hello, hello.
the man himself who got me streaming again. It's all his fault.
It's weird
It's all
being all
my
together
fault,
on a
yes.
Monday.
All together on a Monday, and me in the top position. Whoa, the power, you know.
Please don't start singing any Bob Geldof songs.
But so welcome to the Stream Geek. Is that an OSE book I see in the background there, or is that all your fighting fantasy?
That's all my fighting fantasy.
You know, those books completely missed me when they came out. If anybody doesn't know, on Fridays, Geek tends to do a fun interactive read through for the fighting fantasy on his stream on his channel. It's fun. It's very relaxed, so it's worth checking out.
Yeah, it's meant to be just a way to chill out at the end of the week.
And then Wednesdays is where we all get on and pontificate and act like we actually know what we're talking about on various topics. So it's all good. All right, so Geek,
Wow.
what has your experience been with playing other races, playing fantasy races other than how they're kind of typified in?
I have to say, I find it difficult because my entry into the whole world of fantasy was through the fact that I read The Hobbit when I was about 9 years old.
Yeah.
So that indelibly coloured my attitudes towards how these races would be described and how they would act. The idea of dwarves being greedy, loved a beer, bicker a bit, can be a bit gruff, can be a bit grumpy. That comes straight out of The Hobbit. The idea of hobbits being homely, slightly unwilling adventurers who don't quite understand what's going on. That was Bilbo Baggins. I mean, it all comes from there. And it took me a long time in my teens to realise that Gygax's elves were different to Tolkien's elves, at least in physical appearance.
Yeah, they're short and
they're shorter. Yeah.
And everybody forgets that too. I mean, I remember playing an elf once when I was on the odd instances where I got to play, and the other players are like, "Why is your elf so short?" I'm like, "Because he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be like 4.5 feet tall, 5 feet tall.
5 feet tall, yeah."
But I will say I did try to break the mold a little bit for the most recent game world that I created for my face-to-face group over here. In that, I only allowed my party to start off as humans and halflings in their community, and the idea being that they then met other races in this world they'd landed on. And depending on their interactions, that's whether they become available races or not. And I decided to subvert a few of the tropes in that the elves in that world are quite brutal, quite savage, non-magical. Because they've fallen out with the gods of the world, they've reverted to very animalistic ways. They're still arrogant and aloof, but they're more likely to capture you and sacrifice you to some pagan type deity rather than the gods of the world. They might sacrifice you to the sun or cook you over a bonfire than they are to dance around and sing.
Yeah, I that's one I've seen a couple of times. Actually, I'm trying to pull up an image here if I can. I like what Eberron, for example, did with their drow. Here, these drow are kind of neat. They live on the surface. They live in ruins, and but they're identifiable as drow because they have the black skin. But then they put like the white tattoos and stuff on themselves. And then instead of having a spider affinity, they gave them a scorpion affinity, which is kind of an an easy slide, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, they're definitely depicted as more of a tribal, savage group. And I thought that was always cool. The visual alone is just kind of neat.
That was
In
an
that
awfully
regard.
lush background for Dark Sun.
Oh no, that's Eberron. Those are the
Oh,
Eberron.
Eberron. Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's the
never mind.
Eberron ones. They're on some tropical island or something somewhere. But I'm not a huge Eberron person. It kind of, I don't want my fantasy to be that fantastic. I mean, Eberron's even more fantastic than the default 5e. I mean, trains, airships as regular conveyances, skyscrapers. It's fantasy as if it would be if you had all the resources that fantasy gives you. It's like if you had magic that could feed your people all the time, how would food be scarce? And if you had control over the elements, couldn't you build higher than we did historically? But that's a different animal there. And it's funny you bring up an interesting. Both you bring up a good point. Your introduction to fantasy, I think, has a lot to do with how you see fantasy races. And I was not brought into it having read Tolkien. My introduction to fantasy was more through classic folklore and then comic books like ElfQuest and stuff like that. So in fact, I can say, and this may actually cost me my fantasy geek card. I have yet to read the entire Lord of the Rings.
That's it. I'm out of here. Bye. I can't.
So, in my defense, I grew up around a lot of late 70s, early 80s college academics. And so there were the adults in my life had posters on their walls for those old, really kind of psychedelic Tolkien covers that you used to see. And they would talk about it. So by the time I got to the age where I should be really picking those books up and reading them, I knew the stories well enough. And then thanks to Rankin and Bass and Ralph Bakshi, I'd see the animated versions and stuff like that.
You learn them through osmosis.
Well, and then getting through Tolkien's prose is like, I already know the story. Why am I wading through this?
The secret. There's actually the secret, because I've read the Lord of the Rings twice, and I plan to read it again. And it's, you have to appreciate his use of the prose, his craft at writing. And to somebody who just wants the fast and dirty narrative, that they're just reading it for the story, it's like that will be a slog. Absolutely. But if you're digesting every aspect of what he's presented, it becomes such a different experience.
And I think the big problem for me in that regard was that I already knew where the story was going, even if it was just the Cliff Notes version.
Mm-hmm.
So it was. I think it's easier to get through that kind of stuff and to engage with that kind of stuff if you're doing it to learn what the story is and experience the story. But if you've already heard everybody sitting around the coffee table, all the adults in your life debating what Tolkien meant and what the story beats were, and you've watched the cartoons, and you have the book and record, and all of that, getting through his very dry academic style is hard, which is funny because I will read an academic text on history any day.
Yeah. Even The Hobbit, though. Even The Hobbit. I mean, The Hobbit's a lot.
No, I've read The Hobbit.
No, the Hobbit is presented in a more of the traditional narrative form.
Yeah, I've read The Hobbit before, but The Lord of the Rings was a lot, and I still haven't been able to wade my way all the way through it.
I got lost in it. I read it the first time. I tried reading it as a kid after reading The Hobbit at age 12, and nope, it wasn't happening.
It's just like don't read Brian Jakes and his Redwall stuff if you don't want to hear way too much about food.
Right. Well, or if you want to talk Robert Jordan about fashion, it goes into a lot about what people are wearing. But I when the movies were announced about a year and a half before the first movie was released, I said, okay, I want to read the book, and I want to be far enough from the release of the movie so that it's not too fresh. And I couldn't believe it. I devoured it. I read it in 2 days. Mind you, I was sick in bed, so I had nowhere else to go. So, but and I just loved it. It was like, holy crap, this is an amazing book. And it was, I of course had already completed my education, so I had a better appreciation for language and word crafting and all that. And then I read it again 3 years ago, the year before the pandemic, so 2019, and just revisited it because it had been 20 years. And again, just like, wow, just devouring the craft of the words. I recognize that is absolutely not for everybody, but that helps going in with that mindset. It's not just the story. It is the way he writes the lore and the way he presents the lore, and just right down to the basics, the word use, the craft of the words. He's like, this is a man who probably spent a day over every sentence, just making sure it was where he wanted it to be.
Yeah, I'm very much aware that I should probably go back and try to go through it again as an adult with that kind of appreciation and expectation. But I have to get through the childhood trauma in my.
No judgment.
I haven't read it since my teens. I mean, more recently I was listening to an audiobook of it, but that audiobook I was listening to disappeared off Spotify. So I'm currently in Eregion, and I'm trying to find another audiobook to pick up where I left off. But
let's see here. So we got, what's Grumpy saying? Favorite quote about Tolkien is in French. The English-speaking world is divided into those who
read him
have
and
read
those
him.
who should. Sadly, Christopher Tolkien did not inherit his father's gift. I have a few of the books published under his. I mean, he edited them and controlled them, but there was still, it just didn't have the magic. Right?
Curse you, descendants of great writers. Mr. Herbert, your son sucks too.
I'm going to go back to the kitchen. I'll be back in a bit. I've got a roast gammon in the kitchen in
cool.
the oven.
Well, if you want to just keep yourself on, but mute yourself with that. Yeah, go for it. But yeah, so a couple of real quick hellos. R.W. Bishop, new to my streams. Of course, my streams are new to their streams as well. But and then we got a General Nut finally arrived. And I didn't say hi to him, even though I commented on his comment earlier. Adric, it's a real life friend of mine, and known him for years. Always fun to game with, though he's far away now. All right, so here's a question for you, mages. If you were to play around with reinterpreting any fantasy race, do you think that there's one that you would want to maybe tweak or reinvent?
No, it's nothing I've given too much thought to. I'm just trying to think. I just tend to present them, and if I was going to make a reinvention or tweak, I'd probably just layer it in as a subculture of an existing one, right?
Yeah, and that's I think if you're not creating a world from whole cloth, why not do that? I mean, you're.
I mean, it does make me laugh that it's like I think it was mentioned upstream the humans have infinite varieties even in role playing games, but all the non-humans have one variety.
Yeah, it's funny. Speaking of that, I mentioned earlier in the stream also that I had done. I love your use of the term upstream. I mentioned how I had gone through and mixed and matched all the fantasy races to change their position in the fantasy archetypes. I also did a thing where I went through and wrote up all of the demi-human races as subcultures of fantasy humans.
Right.
Like, let's do a humans only world, but we've got a magical culture, which are kind of the elves, and then we've got our our Smith masters, dwarves, and I realized it works still, and it would be a great way to do a human only campaign world and still have that fantasy flavor.
I have a little lore thing that I do. It's not like common knowledge in my game worlds and whatnot, but the backstory in my mind is that humans were in fact the first race, and all of the demi-humans and humanoids were the gods' attempts to recreate humanity, because humanity came into existence on its own. It wasn't created, right? And thus contextually, that's how I justify my level limits, right? You know, it's like, oh, they weren't created perfectly.
Copies.
Yeah, imperfect copies, different but derived from the same source. So
That's cool.
In a lot of regards, yeah. So I mean, there is that aspect, but again, that's a for the DM to know and the players to discover kind of thing. Nobody really thinks about that, even the races in the game.
I did something similar with the Age of Stone and Bone paleo fantasy setting that I was working on. My original thought, and I'm still not entirely sure if I'm going to leave this on the cutting room floor, was that everybody started out as humans, the early, prehistoric humans. And when magic started to coalesce in the world, certain groups of humans changed because of their exposure to the magic. So those who were more exposed to raw magic, for example, would become elves and gnomes, whereas other ones who sort of adapted to their environments because of the dragons became like the dwarves who burrowed into the ground to get away from the dragons. And then the halflings, they were kind of from outside the world, and the thawing from the ice age allowed them to move into the world, into the core game world. But gnomes would have been those magical folk who sort of took an alternate route to the elves. I think that's a concept that I've heard a couple of times, and I think it's even written into some fantasy novel series somewhere. I think Shannara, the Shannara stuff, as far as I understand it, is, but that's because Shannara is actually a post-apocalyptic mutant future.
Right,
So,
right.
Well,
General, yeah, I was about to say he's talking about the human only campaign. I mean, that's how Gygax wanted it too. He wanted it to be human centric, and probably for that reason, people don't know how to play the alien mindset of another race. I don't let that hold my players back, but it's one of those things. I love it when a player can separate and present that alien point of view. It's rare, but it's interesting to watch.
I think one of the best examples I've run into personally with this was when my brother was playing a lizard man character in 5th edition. And it talks very much in 5th edition. It's probably one of the best write-ups for how to play a race that's not, a human in a suit. Because it talks about how they're emotionally detached. They don't get nuance. They don't have any concept of what the sort of warmth that makes up the other races. And my brother would play it up really well. Like, he realized that other races tried to smile and put each other at ease. So when we were in a tough spot in the game, his lizard man he's making this big creepy grin with all of his sharp teeth.
Yeah.
And then he knew that people were looking for things, but to him, because lizardmen, one of the other things that lizardmen have in 5th edition, they talk about how they're very specific. Like, I need this for this, and not just the concept of I need, right? Like, not need for need's sake, but just need for a purpose. And so he was always going through the dungeon. He was with us because we had saved him from a menagerie. That was his backstory. That's how we got him into the campaign late. He was in a cage at a carnival, basically. And he kept going around the dungeon, picking things up randomly. It's like, is this what you're looking for? It's like, is this the thing? Is this why we're here?
No, that's a handful of poo. Oof, it's a good thing I almost stepped in it. Yeah.
That, and he didn't seem to understand why it was so disheartening that he kept trying to make tools out of the remains of the things we had just killed.
Right.
It's like, but yeah, that's one of the. I mean, fifth edition did a good job actually writing that one up as far as alien mindsets. But you're right. With elves are supposed to kind of have this weird, somber disconnection, I think, and or be just kind of flighty and detached. Like in a way that I think would often read as just like airhead to a lot of people. But you don't see people play them that way.
No, and that's pretty common. But at the same time, it's you take a step back and realize that not everybody's a trained actor or character analyst, and
Yeah.
they're just there to play a game. So it's like,
Although it does say something about the human race when I find that people have no problem playing half orcs properly.
It's like, violent and bloodthirsty.
Yes, let me access my brutal side.
Yeah. But that compassion part, oh no, I can't do that.
Halflings are easy because that's just playing yourself.
Yeah.
Fat nerd from the basement.
Yeah,
get out in the real world.
Let me access my lazy side. Yeah. Except most people play halflings as fairly proactive.
Yeah. It's like, okay, so all I need to do to play a halfling accurately is just remember that one time I summoned up enough gumption to leave my house and go shopping. But no, it's good stuff. I mean, I think if anybody were to write a role playing game that really wanted to get people to play demi-humans as something other than people, they'd have to spend a lot of time and effort bringing that into the text of the game. And even still, I don't think people would use it because, I mean, second edition gave us entire books dedicated to specific races.
I was going to bring that up because I actually quite like I like those splat books.
Oh yeah,
I don't like the mechanical options, but I love the role playing options that were introduced, and especially the racial guides. And I'll often refer players to them. It's like, think about this. Think about the in the case of the elves, the meditation they do, where they can sync up and join their minds, sort of like a Vulcan mind meld, and the way they approach things. Dwarves, the idea that dwarves, because dwarven women are rare, the idea is that a dwarven woman is expected to remarry if her spouse dies, but the other way around is not the case. A dwarven man who has had a wife and the wife has died is now expected to remain single for the rest of his existence.
Yeah, that lore kind of got deep. I remember at one point, this I think may have come out. I don't think this is in second edition, but I think it's a third edition invention. Talking about the drow and just how ingrained their evil was. It's clearly that they were created evil. Right, to the point where it talks about how most drow pregnancies are like 2 or 3 at a time, but they often kill each other in the womb.
Like sharks.
Yeah, I'm like, that is brutal. But it spoke to their culture that had been tainted so heavily by an evil god in it, and I think it works in the default context of D&D as an alignment-based creationist environment. And that's the thing, I find it so funny that we have problems with, monocultures and stuff like that. And I don't think that, the funny thing is, I don't think monoculture has ever been the problem that it's been made out to be in gaming. Because I remember, at least for my 2 groups of orcs might be different. And even the printed modules would talk about how the orcs of the blah 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 are much more prone to dealing with men than the orcs of such and such, or you'd have those opportunities or those towns that have deals with demi-humans and stuff, so it wasn't so cut and dry. But I always found it weird that in an environment that is ostensibly creationist with living gods, that the idea that beings could be made a certain way was such a hard concept for folks to grasp.
Yeah. Even though in real life, creationists tend to think we were made in a very specific and certain way.
Yeah, and although I'm kind of curious what they were. Let's look demographically at D&D players and see how many hardline religious folks there are.
Well, I
But
think that number is certainly up now.
it is definitely up now because we've figured out that D&D isn't any more evil than anything else.
Than punk rock music.
Dragon Magazine did some great stuff. Yeah, I mean the Dragon did a lot of good stuff and a lot of good articles on. I mean, their ecologies were great for figuring out like the nuances of monsters, but they revisited over the years. What do they call? They had a series of articles like the such and such point of view was their big thing on the cultures, like the halfling point of view, the dwarf point of view, and then they of course did those great articles on the pantheons of those gods, of those races, which then got expanded in the Splat book for the non-human gods that they did. Actually, I think some of the most interesting aspects of the demi-human cultures in D&D, even as far back as AD&D, can be kind of mined out of the deities and demigods type stuff, the god books, because you really read, and it's like any other culture, reading their myths and their stories tells you a lot about what's important to them. Let's see.
Echo is back.
Yeah, welcome back. But and it's funny as on the topic of making like iterations of demi-humans, I feel like there's less of a, at least as a creator myself, creationist, as a creator, I'm not a creationist, as a creator myself, I feel less inclined to reinvent the non-Tolkien races than I do the Tolkien races. And I think that's because the Tolkien races have been done to death so much. Um, although I have to say, like, my version of gnomes, my default image of gnomes is very much more drawn from like the classic gnomes books. Remember those art books from back in the 80s, David the Gnome and all of that. That whole nature gnome.
Mm-hmm. Slant is saying, Tolkien influenced the races alignment. I have nothing to say for or against that. I don't know if that's a true assertion, but I guess it easily could be.
Well, it's interesting because there's a really nice obscure piece of evidence in Tolkien. One of the few pieces I've read it basically just to find the source of the information. Is even his orcs weren't irredeemable. And that term I think often carries more weight than it needs to, because being redeemable just means that there's the possibility.
Right.
Doesn't necessarily speak to how likely it is. But there's the two orcs in the tower that are that are standing over Frodo, and they're talking about just buggering off and leaving the whole war, getting some of the boys and going off and doing their own thing, which to me is it speaks to the fact that the orcs clearly are not some monolithic fixed mindset, that they do have enough free thought and individuality to conceive of something better.
Mm-hmm. Well, even in D&D, I mean, the races alignments are the general trend for that specific race. That's not the absolute that every individual must be.
Yeah, and that gets lost so often.
That gets lost, yeah.
People read that and they're like, this is exactly what you are. I'm like, well, no. And it's never even been written that way. I mean, I think when we were talking about the druids on Geek Stream, and I brought up how often druids are put into D&D as NPCs that are evil. How many evil druids do you run into throughout the various modules? Or
well, a druid is only, evil based on what your goal is, but a druid isn't a race either. That is a specific choice that a person has made to follow a philosophy.
No, I'm speaking more towards like just how people interpret alignment.
Right.
But yeah, races. I think the alignment system is great for shorthand, and that's really what it's supposed to be. I mean,
Well, I have opinions on alignment. We don't want to derail your talk.
But no, in terms of how it goes for demi-humans, most orcs are going to
Are going to
behave
be
in a manner that is lawful evil.
consistent. Yeah, exactly. But there will be outliers, and everybody is, your DM is obviously going to have outliers. If the DM allows them as playable races as a character class, you're allowed to choose the outlier.
Yeah, and I think if you look at it in terms of, like, even if we look at, say, like modern world views, for example, right? It's comparable to how people will see, say, like religions or nations. We look at, Muslims, and it conjures up a sort of monolithic view for a lot of folks, but there's so much nuance there. And even within particular groups there's nuance. And so when you're saying like orcs are lawful evil, and I think this is still on topic because we're talking about iterations of classic races and stuff. Orcs are lawful evil. Okay, well, that means that all the spectrum within lawful evil exists within the orcs, and then there's the outliers, like you said. So lawful evil isn't necessarily just one thing either. You might have a group of orcs that outwardly might even seem almost kind of good in what they manage to accomplish, but they're still doing it in a way that makes it lawful evil, right?
Yeah.
They have order, and they have clean streets, and they they have pension plans, but
well, that would be a societal thing, and that would be lawful.
Exactly, and that's the lawful aspect. But yeah, it's and I guess that's the one of the axes on which you can interpret and reinvent your.
But it boils down to how you define good and evil in your games too, and that will vary greatly from table to table. Slan makes a comment here. It's funny how druids are corrupted by evil, but never by good. And I actually think you see druids, quote unquote, corrupted by good all the time, but because they're aligned with the good guys, you don't think anything of it. You don't think of it as a corruption from a druidic standpoint. It's like, oh, he's with us. He's helping us. We got to fix this problem.
Yeah, I think it's actually, you can even almost equate that to just perceptions of nature, right? Mm-hmm. Nature doing its thing is just nature doing its thing. It's not good or evil, but we definitely look at a cruel winter or a harsh summer as nature being evil, even though notch it down up or down by a few degrees, and we're okay with it. But we're still probably going to complain more about a regular winter than we will a regular summer. And the regular summer is beautiful and warm and happy. And look, the crops are growing well, even though blight is part of the natural, scheme of things order, too, But so yeah, the evil druid is going to, or the druid that leans towards evil acts is going to stand out. And, I do find that it's weird that some of the hey, Geek, welcome back.
Hello.
How's the roast?
I opened the oven and it was actually done. So I've actually just eaten it.
Well, there you go.
I've been away for a bit longer.
No, that's all right. Eat your food.
Because it's nice.
Roasts are always better fresh, anyways.
Yeah. And so I've just carved it up and served it, and my son's eating his. I've just eaten mine. My daughter's about to get hers. She's just home from work. So yes, very nice.
I forget that it's dinner time there.
Mm-hmm. It's 5:20. So.
Right.
Yeah. So we've kind of diverged into the alignments of races and stuff, and how they're often interpreted. But yeah, I don't know.
Lawful dwarves, chaotic elves, but good-leaning chaotic elves.
Well, we were talking about orcs, but yeah.
It's a race. I mean, orcs. I mean, they are a classic Tolkien race, right? Mm-hmm. It technically fits the theme of the stream. And actually, honestly, the name of the stream was, admittedly a little clickbaity, but, because it, really it hits a little harder than, hey, let's talk about reinterpreting fantasy races as a whole. That just doesn't zing as much,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think. I mean, if you ever really want to look at how far that can be thrown to the four winds, do pick up Talislanta and just thumb through the various races. Their whole thing of no classic, no elves and no classic fantasy races is a bunch of crap, but they have so many iterations in there of everything. And then they have some unique stuff too that you don't see in typical races, in typical fantasy games.
When does it become too many, though? When do they start becoming indistinct because there are too many?
Real quick. And I think that's one of the problems with Talislanta is there's so many races in there. First of all, it's really hard to conceive of that many species existing in proximity to one another. I mean, D&D does it all the time, but it's often like pockets of this and that here and there, and then occasionally you'll get nations. But
and if you have too many as well, wouldn't each one become overly specific and even more sort of what's the word?
Niche?
No, I'm thinking of what Gygax is often described as being when he's taken out of context a little bit.
Racist?
Well, yeah, in a way. I mean,
white guy in a basement.
let's just say if you've just got elf, then you've got quite a broad spectrum that can be within elf.
Yeah,
but bioessential is what I'm thinking of.
Oh, okay.
If you have more, for example, 20 different types of elves, then there's going to be more specifics and, if anything, more bioessentialism in there, rather than having, for example, elf and having a broad variety.
Right.
Absolutely. It's funny because bioessentialism, bioessentialism itself is not necessarily bad. Bioessentialism applied to humanity is bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I've argued this before. If we take a broader look at bioessentialism, there is definitely good examples for why different distinct species are going to be different.
Yes.
My dog is not as capable as a wolf, even though technically they're the same. They're almost the same species. My
it's
dog
like
is a Chihuahua.
Homo sapiens and Neanderthal man.
Exactly,
Different,
or a gorilla and a
species.
chimpanzee.
Exactly.
They have different mental capacities and they have different physical capacities, and nobody's going to argue that a dolphin and a blue whale are identical and capable of the same things, even though they're
both mammals.
Yeah, they're very much the same creature. I mean, in broad strokes. But yeah, I think if you do get the more specific you get, the more the harder it gets to actually have any meaningful choice made with your character choice. Either, if we're going to go into actual game design concepts for this topic as well, because at that point, all your choices are just little micro corrections. Because the only way to have that kind of distinction without getting into wide sweeping high concept stuff, which is honestly, I think, if you're going to do that, the best way, like have everything be really, really interesting to where all of those choices all those choices matter. But the way that games often write them up, it's like, here's a couple of ribbon abilities and a couple of stat adjustments. So now it's like, which ribbon ability is slightly better than the other one, along with my +1 and my +2. Kind of. Geek is frozen.
Is he? Oh, well, there he is.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that you do reach that point where you have saturation and you're just
a few computer issues.
But yeah,
again. John, say something so we know you're still with us. I wonder if we should screenshot this picture. It's not as funny as the Greek geek growling, but there he goes.
True. Yeah, I'm not going to do that to him. He gets enough of that as well on his own stream. Forbidden Lands take on halflings and goblins is neat. I'm not familiar with that one, Squirrel Hermit. I don't know what the goblins and halflings in Forbidden Lands is. I mean, if you want to look at the ultimate like non-monoculture for non-humans, for humanoids, to look at as far as published stuff, look at all the way back to RuneQuest, where everything from a goblin up to a troll was all the kind of the same species, just different subspecies of them, and they had different outlooks and stuff. I don't mind a game that has nothing but humans, yet different folks get different strokes.
I played one session.
One session of Forbidden Lands. I think Geek 7.
Yeah, I think his internet's not cooperating.
So Squirrel Hermit, yeah, I mean, I think in that case, what you're looking at is more of an archetypical fantasy setting. Like any write-up of, say, like the Conan world that I've seen often attributes different lands to having different core skill sets, and oh, you're Hyrcanian, therefore you're good with bows and horses, and you're Cimmerian, therefore you're good at survival and stuff like that. Even though with any one of those cultures, they're probably going to have they would necessarily, as living human beings, have diverse skill sets that don't necessarily stand out. I mean, we do have real world cultures that were known for things, but whether they were markedly better at those things is kind of up for debate in a lot of cases. But you back, Geek?
Am I here again?
You are. You were freezing up.
Going back to the whole Tolkien thing, and one of the games I keep mentioning a lot, Middle Earth, had some very, very different humans in that. Very, very different bonuses and penalties and skill sets across the various human cultures. The Rohirrim started with 8 skill ranks on riding, for example. The Dunedain got bigger bonuses. The Woodsmen were good at wood type things. Dunlendings got bonuses to performance type skills because they were known for their songs or their stories.
Yeah, I think in Tolkien though, his peoples are much more synonymous with nations rather than actual like physical things. I mean, it makes sense that the Rohirrim, being horse lords, would all have better horse skills because they're probably raised in the saddle. Yeah. But I would, and that makes sense, and that's what I was just kind of mentioning before you came back about, like, if you're looking at, say, like a Conan world, if you're talking about, Hyboria, you're also going to be running into that because they tend to do that sort of archetypical, and arguably racist thing where like, oh, you're from such and such culture, you're sneaky and shifty and deceitful and evil because Stygia. And that you're a barbarian, therefore you're dumb. But
that sort of thing aids the creation of stories in the world. It creates conflict, and stories are born out of conflict.
Yeah. And it also, and what I find a lot of people still forget in when you're creating fantasy worlds is that they are archetypical. You're not playing real world sociopolitical spectrum at any point in history. Whether it's modern politics and modern society or medieval politics and society, you're playing something that's a celebration or an amplification of that, or at best and at worst a pastiche.
Yeah, well, that's something else a lot of players forget, is that you're not playing the modern game. You're not playing. They try to infuse their modern beliefs and systems into the game world, even if the game world is meant to be completely alien. If you're playing a modern day set Call of Cthulhu, well, yeah, by all means infuse that, because that's got grounding in reality. But if we're playing a medieval based game, there is a completely alien belief set.
Yeah, and
it takes quite a mature level of discipline to keep that up, though, doesn't it? In terms of keeping it all tied together. Certainly, I know when we were kids, we gave it no thought at all. I give it a lot of thought now, because it's more what I lean towards now, trying to get those sort of ideas consistent.
But it's a simple matter, as you say, it's mature. It's a simple matter of, okay, I've infused, and I do it all the time. I'll put modern vernacular, modern jokes, modern references, and then if a DM reminds me, it's like, well, in this society, spitting out onto the ground is an insult, and they'll cut your hand off. It's like, oh yeah, I got to remember that. As opposed to arguing the point, which
Shadow
a lot of players I will see do that. They will argue the point, and it's like, well, we're playing a game, and in this world, these are the rules.
Now, that said, I mean, being that we get to create our worlds, I mean, if that's the agreement at the table, then anybody can play whatever they want. I mean, that's the rule. I mean, honestly, that is at your table what you want.
But if that's the agreement, that's the agreement. Yeah. That's different.
Yeah.
But
at the same time, though.
But if I've got an established game, don't come to my table demanding I make concessions for your sensibilities.
Exactly.
Sorry, go away.
Oh, it's Hungar. What's he got to say? I've got something to say about the situation. You guys know that I do a show Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 12:30. Come on, guys. Okay, cool.
The overlap.
Yeah.
Hungar, it's 5:35 in the evening. Your clocks are wrong.
Yeah, I think I don't think D&D has ever been exactly medieval, or anything like that. Because I've seen the extremes on the other side of the argument, where like, oh, it's definitely a medieval, hard medieval setting, and we should we should all be drinking out of filthy pools of water and blah blah. And like, I'm first of all, that's a really wrong interpretation of the Middle Ages, but and also it's not, because if you look at the world of Greyhawk, for example, just going back to the old schoolist world there is, right? You have so many different cultures and tech levels bouncing around, and the artistic interpretations of D&D throughout the ages has ranged from everything from Roman era all the way up to Renaissance full plate and interchangeable, so clearly we're not in one fixed point in time in one society. The amount of glass in windows alone in D&D illustrations is ahistorical.
Yeah. But again, fantasy worlds, you can break and bend some rules. Okay, so they have the technology to create all the glass they want. Okay, we accept it.
I mean, to speak to a topic that I've run into a couple of times, and we're off topic, but we all know that the streams reach a certain point where we can go off topic. Now, I don't do monster 4-hour streams like Geek does. But, I've only got so I have a buddy who seems to run into the worst luck in encountering people who really want to push LGBTQ stuff into games. Now, if you want it in your games, that's cool. I'm definitely an ally, and I have to be, and I want to be. But I don't feel like obliged to necessarily put it in my games. Will it appear in my games sometimes? Sure, because you know what? I know who's at my table, and I know the audience I'm playing for. So yes, I've had, for example, an innkeeper who was a woman who had a wife in one game. Did I spend the entire session focusing on that? No, it was an offhanded thing. It's like, hey, hun, can you come out front and help me? Sure, babe. Comes out from back, gives a peck on the cheek, delivers the drinks.
This is what it is. Move on. Yeah,
exactly. Because in real life, that's how it is. Nobody walks around like an MMO with a giant sign above their head that says "gay."
Yeah, I mean, I had a bard in my game who was blatantly Freddie Mercury.
Well, and that's the thing, and the flip side of that too is like, if you're playing Call of Cthulhu 1920s, who really wants to spend a crap ton of time focusing on the racism and the misogyny of the time?
You mention it in passing. You use it to flavor the world if necessary.
Yeah,
but
it
you don't
comes up in
harp on
specific
about it, yeah.
NPCs or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, like we were playing a game. My wife plays a woman. She's a woman of means, though, so she has a high credit rating, so she can often get herself out of situations. But you know, they were in a small town, and the sheriff is like refusing to talk to her because there are men present. You know,
Yeah.
did she get all butthurt about that? No, because it's the 20s. Now, am I going to bother to knuckle down on that and go, okay, well, now you guys are all in trouble because you transported an unmarried woman across state lines? No.
We had an NPC. I played in a game a little while back where there was an NPC paladin who the DM portrayed him as being very, very old-fashioned, very traditional old English. And as soon as the female player, who was playing a female barbarian in the game, opened her mouth, he went, "Halt! I wish to speak to whoever's in charge around here, not the domestic." But she took it well, because it was designed to just show his personality. He wasn't a bad guy. He was just we'd actually resurrected him as well. So he was from 200 or 300 years in the past in the story of the game. So he just embellished it and
that's playing it up in a specific NPC. You know, because
yes.
I mean, you know, I know like in one of Seth Korkowski's videos, he talks about having a NPC bookshop owner or something, it was antique shop owner or something like that, who is very racist towards the Chinese character in their group, and he played it up. The guy's very much a pretentious, blue bloody kind of, you know, hoity-toity, you know, antiquist who was like, you know, who was like, oh, those people, and just made them hate the character even more. And you can definitely do that. And we do that in D&D all the time. You peasants, how dare you speak to me, and blah blah blah. You know,
you definitely want the class structure.
When I ran Temple of Death for X5 for my group going back ages ago, I added a bit of flavor. There's a town which not much is mentioned about it in the module, but it's mentioned that it's not a pleasant place, and it is very, very strict in terms of its attitudes, very regimented. So I brought in a few things in there to make it less pleasant, and I had the guards insist that the party muzzled the elf in the party, because elves were not trusted, and elves were treated as slaves and typically had their tongues cut out.
Yeah.
And if he didn't want to have his tongues cut out, he had to be muzzled for his entire time, because they wouldn't trust them.
You can even build it into games in this sort of like talks about reiterating fantasy races in games. You can build off that those notes of prejudice. Like I have my most developed human focused campaign setting is a Renaissance setting, but without gunpowder. So it's like you got the Renaissance trappings and everything like that, and it's an imperialist setting where humans have come from another land, conquered basically half this continent under one banner. There's a resident human culture, but most of what they do is they push the humanoids out of the way. And so you've got orcs and hobgoblins and trolls and all that on the border. There are no elves. There are no halflings living around. There are dwarves, but they're dark and sketchy. And you know, basically the default dwarf in this setting is like the Durgar. But in that game, there are. I didn't want it to be just humans, so I offered one other option, and that's the Blackbloods, and that's you can play the orcs that have pretty much integrated into human society, and they use half orc stats to show that they've sort of lost their savage edge, their wild edge. But one of the plot lines in that campaign was there was the Black Blood League, which was like a kind of a political movement within the human societies to try and get better treatment for the orcs. And there was this one imperial regiment that was made up all of orcs that had this sense of pride, like we gotta show off, we gotta show what the Black Bloods can do, and it was a plot point in the universe. but it created some cool angles and dynamics for characters. Like the Black Blood League were out doing almost like suffrage type movements, for their kind, and would often, if your orc character got in trouble, you could go to the Black Blood League and like, I need money for bail, yeah, because or do you have a lawyer who can help me get out of this? And it was a fun element to put in the setting that was otherwise kind of a human, imperialist setting.
Did we lose Geek again? Are you frozen
he
there,
seems
John?
to be having issues. Yeah. Let's see.
John's connection is a big steaming turd tonight.
Yeah.
I've just
looking through some of the
put something in the.
Nope.
To your point about the elves being treated as second-class citizen, I always love watching players react, because players love being high status, and then watching them grit their teeth when they are forced to play low status.
Oh yeah.
It's maybe I'm a little bit of a cruel DM, but I love seeing it.
Yeah, or just in general, like even if it's not because of their race.
Oh yeah, any reason.
Yeah.
Class structure. I get players lipping off nobles all the time, and like, are you mad? All you have to say is 2 words, and you're in the stocks.
It can also be fun to play a character who's obviously of a different class setting than the rest of the party. Like I remember playing my Cavalier back in AD&D, and anytime we ran into nobles, I'm not going to be staying at the inn. I've been invited to stay with the local lord, and because I'll be entertaining people at the lord's table with my tales of daring do and my heroic deeds as a cavalier of the realm, kind of a thing.
It's a perk to being a knight.
I'm entitled to nightly hospitality.
Yep. We my 5th ed game, which started I guess about just over a year ago. One of the first players who subsequently left, he took the noble background, and one of the other players couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand the fact that he had to play low status to this guy, and he's like, that's too powerful. That's too powerful for any player to have. He just kept complaining rather than just play the dynamic. Even though he was playing a foreigner, he was playing a foreigner, no less, right? A foreigner to the land. It's like, okay, so you're a foreigner and you're lipping off one of the nobility, and you don't want repercussions. He felt that was inappropriate for a player character to have that. It's like,
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking in it kind of reminds me of like playing science fiction games or any RPG, I should say, where the characters are within a command structure. It's really tough and I try to avoid giving the ultimate command authority to a PC. But like, if you're playing, say, a military game and you have a rank structure, well, you kind of have to follow that, right? I don't like to have. Oh, good.
I say, am I back now?
You are back, yeah.
Oh,
and Hungar has this comment. I play a character the background was a prince, not like the main prince, but a prince of a kingdom. Went to a different city. Yeah, and that's the thing. You have these things, but also, you can also get that even without being necessarily royalty. Like if you're playing a craftsman, often you can expect, if there's a guild hall in the city you're visiting, that you can probably get room there, rooming there. But yeah, it's fun to do.
In our Call of Cthulhu game, I've been running the Reign of Terror one. There is that command structure in the party, in that one of the Gingerbeard is playing the sergeant, and the other players are playing privates. So ultimately, Gingerbeard has to make the decision.
Yeah,
I don't want to hear about Gingerbeard's privates. Sorry.
I know every time I've run Star Trek, for example, because I've run Star Trek as an RPG for several times, I never let a player play the captain of the ship. I'm like, because that's just too much authority.
Well,
Also,
Ginger Beard's
It
having
depends on the group too. Like anything, it depends on the group. There
Yeah.
are lots of groups I think they'd eat it right up. So
having the
Ginger Beard's
captain be
character still has to answer to my NPC, who is the captain. There's Captain
Yeah.
Malon, who gives Gingerbeard the instructions, and Gingerbeard then has to disseminate those instructions to the party. And then
and the
Gingerbeard
advantage
has
of
to
having the captain as an NPC, though, is it's actually a great motivator for the flow of the campaign, because he can always give high orders, but also it gives the lower level characters, the lower ranked characters, somebody else that they could potentially go to if you have, especially if you have a player who is wanting to abuse that rank. And in a long flowing Star Trek campaign, for using my experience with it mostly, you can have situations like that, which is always where the GM has to step in. It's like, you're a Starfleet officer, you wouldn't do that, but then it gets really hard to make that argument, considering what you see some Starfleet officers do in Star Trek. But even like playing Robotech, the old Palladium Robotech game, that's another military structure. Or even when we were playing Twilight 2000, even if you're in a militia, you've got a command structure. Otherwise, you just can't function operationally. So it's always an interesting one to put people in positions of authority.
And it depends on the player dynamic. I mean, we talk about my Night Below campaign. There is a de facto leader of the group, the guy playing the Priest of Mask. But one of the other characters, the female elf, she's chaotic neutral, right? And now the player in this case is new. She's brand new to the games, and we got her into it. The player is actually Rick's fiance, the guy who plays the Priest of Mask, and she's like, so I have to do everything he says. It's like, no, you're chaotic neutral. You can do as you please.
Yeah, that's it's fun when you have people who buy into it. That is true. And to Shadow's point here about there often needs to be a player character that has to be the captain. I think there's a difference between the small ship's crew, Firefly, or all the folks hanging out on Han Solo's ship. That's different. There's going to be command structure, but I think when we're talking about large political or social or military structures that have wide-ranging power, you definitely kind of need more.
I think a game of Star Trek could be good with all the players being the command crew. I don't think there'd be a problem there. But again, it's like I can't speak to that broadly. I can see some players not liking that idea, so it's group dependent. But
yeah, I mean,
the game could be fun. I'll be the science officer. All right, so be it.
Well, and there is one caveat to that. If you do have a character who is firmly invested in whatever command or social political structure that you have, and especially in a game with a solid military, and that player who's in command decides to abuse it, there's always the oversight of the officers or the rulers above them. Yeah. I mean, in Star Trek, again, if you're having that character who's the captain and he keeps abusing the crap out of his captainship, well, Starfleet's gonna come cracking down on him. You can get court-martialed.
Well, the player playing the ship's doctor says, "Well, I do believe you are out of your mind, and I have authority to remove you from position."
Exactly. And that noble who keeps wanting to swing his sword around all the time and really play off that the fact that he's a noble and untouchable. Well, you may only be a knight or a baron or something. Hey, Hungar, welcome. I'm bringing him in. Here he is. It's Hungar.
I'm on the show with the old geek.
Yeah,
hello, Hungar. You right?
Welcome,
What's up,
welcome.
guys? Here, let me get rid of this guy.
We did have an actual comment from Squirrel Hermit that I brought up here, which is half orcs and half elves, yay or nay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I use them regularly in my games. I don't put restrictions on them. I mean, it's by the book, right? But I like to, in the case of half elves more specifically, because half elves will be a little more common. I'm creating this idea that they're also their own culture almost. You know, some places the humans love half elves; they're a blessing. In some places, even the elves love them. But conversely, sometimes as well, you know, they're mongrels, they're half breeds get away. But for the most part, they're seen in a positive light.
I was in a campaign once. DM James was running where we had a half elf ranger, or not half elf, half orc ranger, and he came up with such a great backstory. I mean, he wasn't extremely smart, but he was an intellectual. He liked to read books. Anytime where we went somewhere where there was a book that he could purchase, he would buy it. And he was the dwarf cleric's best friend. I played the dwarf cleric, but his whole backstory was his mom was an orc, but he was a half orc.
Right.
So that means that a human.
So his other mom was also an orc or a human, right? His other mom was a human, yeah. No, sorry, that didn't land. That didn't land. Never mind. I forget I said anything.
Yeah, he was a half orc. So his dad was a human, and that was a strange situation because the orc village got raided by humans.
Yeah.
Right.
But that makes sense in the context of humans being bastards and actually doing some pretty cruddy things. You know?
Human raiders are not abnormal even in D&D worlds. So
Geek, go ahead. Yay or nay on half elves, half orcs?
I allow them, though I don't like them to be common in the world. I do fall on a little bit on the Tolkien's trope here of them. The unions between humans and elves being unusual.
Yeah.
It's not always the case that your mother and father are going to be pure human and pure elf. One of them may have been a half elf, so you might be part elf, in which case still a half elf.
Quarter elf.
But you'd still class as being a half elf because you've got a bit of elven blood in you, in my opinion. But I don't. Yeah, I just don't want them to be thought of as common. Like a half orc, for example, is going to be. I want the character to be troubled in some way because
most of the time it would be a product of rape. Yeah,
exactly.
There's very few circumstances I can see in classic D&D, at least, especially where an orc and a human having a union is going to be consensual.
No. In my world, it's never going to be consensual.
Yeah, I mean, at best, it was an experiment.
unless the
I was young and I needed the money.
No, or like, the Mad Wizard. I was trying to make the ultimate warrior, an orc that could go out in the day. So I captured some orcs and I found some less than good men.
Unless the mother is extremely depraved. And thus possibly not a great mother.
You're going to get that time where, the odd chance that an elf falls in love with a human or a human falls in love with an elf.
Yeah.
The odd time.
Like with
those two races are close enough to where it makes sense, though. I mean, visually
Yeah, but with half orcs, there's going to be some kind of weird grape situation going on.
Yeah. I have interchangeably had them in my worlds and not had them in my worlds or reskinned them. The two best instances I've ever run into of a half elf and a half orc was the half elves. Actually, it was interesting. In one game I played in, half elves were ostracized by both cultures. So they actually the campaign we were in had a tiny little kind of out of the way village that was all half elves, and it was like basically all the half elves from wherever they were born, whether they were born to the elves or the humans, sort of just kind of gravitated there. And it was played up as this weird kind of bohemian community. It was kind of interesting.
I'm setting up something similar. I'm writing it up as an adventure thread where that's exactly it. Half elves have united and formed their own nation, and have the interpolitics, the superiority belief. Hey, we are superior to our parents, right?
Exactly.
And they want revenge. And then the others who are like, no, we are our own people. We don't have to go maliciously hunting everybody else for being mistreated. Great adventure thread.
The best half orc I've ever run into was created by my friend who really doesn't like RPGs, but played them with us because that's what we're playing. And he wanted. I'm pretty sure he made this character just because he knows where my preferences as a DM lay in character classes. So he made a half orc monk because I'm not a fan of monks, and I'm not a fan of the half orcs in general. But
let's really bother Eli, half orc monk.
You have to understand, my friend.
Yeah, and you got to look at it like Dark Sun. Didn't they have like all kinds of weird mixed races?
They have the moles, which are the half dwarf, half humans, or whatever.
Yeah, and half giants, and half this, and half that.
And then the thralls, which are specifically bred.
His so would a half giant, half ling be just human?
Well, a half halfling is a quarterling, but
I've never even heard of a halfling.
No, it's not a thing. But
it's a joke.
I did love his origin for his half-orc character, his half-orc monk. His half-orc monk was a half-orc that was left on the doorstep of the monastery. The monks took him in, and he was not allowed to play in any of the monk games, but he was a foundling, and they were going to take care of him, right? But the old master kind of saw talent in him. He basically caught that half-orc, trying to mimic what they were doing. Like he'd be out there sweeping the yard and trying to flip his broom around like a staff. And so, and mind you, this origin story is coming from a guy who doesn't like RPGs. He's like, yeah, my guy was allowed to kind of observe and, watch the training and was put to tasks kind of in a Mr. Miyagi style that helped him learn the basics of the training.
Did he put the wax on the axe blades? And
exactly. And then he was allowed to accidentally stumble on the final rite of passage. And then so like once he had completed the rite of passage for the order, they're like, well, he passed it. We have to let him be a monk. And it was just this great origin story. I'm like, you say you don't like RPGs, but you're good at them.
Well, it doesn't mean it's like storytelling and creativity.
He could have stole that from 47 Ronin with Keanu Reeves.
This is well before that movie came out, but it's also not. It's actually kind of Kwai Chang Caine from Kung Fu, if you think about it.
Yeah, that sounds like you say, for somebody who doesn't like RPGs. That dude did really, really well.
Oh yeah, his bounty hunter in our Star Wars games was fun too. But he was an interesting guy. But let's see. Let's see if we got any other.
Clan came up with the good questions. Can half elves and half orcs have children together?
No. No. So I rule that certain races cannot breed with each other.
Well, he didn't say together, right? Yeah, I mean with each other, but I mean I think he's implying just even with themselves. Like if two half elves
are they mules?
Are they mules? Are they sterile, or can two half elves produce another, effectively a half elf? That's fairly good for world building. Like, what if two half orcs breed and produce another half orc, and then you've got a half orc that is born of love.
Well, the funny thing is that that's not even necessary. That's not even exclusively true in real world. There are off chances, and it does occur on very rare incidences that even mules procreate. It's rare, but
if you look at Dragonlance, Tannis Half-Elven
had children.
Ended up marrying Lorena, and they had children. So yeah, half elf can breed with a half elf or a human.
It's really up to the DM, of course. I allow it. I don't see any reason that they necessarily need to be sterile, but there's also a real world scientific justification for how they might be. So yeah, as Slant says, world building. What do you want in your world?
That is, and that's an entirely different topic. Like the weird necessity and inconsistency of wanting to apply the science to the fantasy. I don't know how many my rage on that in 5th edition is on turtles.
My fantasy laughs at your science.
Well, the thing is, like, people were insisting that turtles should be really long lived because real world turtles are, and I'm like,
real world turtles aren't humanoid and can
well,
talk.
yeah, and I came up with a big long answer to it, but I'm like, if you really want to get your science in there, your dragon can't fly, the giant crumbles under his own weight.
Explain rocks. If it's not fantasy, explain rocks.
Yeah.
They're way too big to be flying. Their wingspan is not that big for their body.
Yeah, you stop. I mean, it doesn't help that the original AD&D description of Fireball was a small dissertation on physics, but and
Right,
thermodynamics.
but there's a point where, you know, the discussions between realism and verisimilitude, right? What works in context, what's grounded in context versus what is realistic to our world.
Yeah, and what they were doing there is explaining the function of fire, not the fact that we just created fire from nowhere, which is the fantasy.
Right.
I've got to do a shout out real quick to my beautiful Filipina Maylene. She's following me around because I normally do my show at this time, so she was waiting, so she jumped over here to this show to watch you guys just see me. So what up, baby?
We'll pull this up. There we go.
Mwah.
Hello.
Hiya.
The science issue comes up a lot with animals, actually, in my games. You know, it's like, you know, I'll get players going, well, animals don't act like that, or that specific animal. I'm like, well, yeah, on Earth you'd be correct, but in this world it's a different ecology, so any variation is chopped up to different worlds. You know, I'm not going to study zoology so I can have a little perfect realism.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, fantasy stories would be really boring if we just removed how wolves act in fantasy versus wolves in real life. You know,
I mean,
like,
I do try to infuse what I know about their behavior and make it, you know, give it that grounding. But any variation, anything that I don't know, you just chalk it up to we're in a fantasy world where they evolved differently.
Yeah,
Well,
it's like Shadow says, magic finds a way. Whenever they want me to explain a weird creature or weird thing, my number one thing is magic.
Yeah, taking it back to Tolkien and my Saturday Merp game, I had them finding evidence of owls or an owl taking out the Creebane that were spying on them. And my idea all along that this owl was a giant owl that was actually Radagast.
there you go.
But yet the party were trying to work out what the owls were doing. And it muddied the waters when a mutilated, freshly killed body of a deer was dropped close to their inn. And all it was Radagast bringing them food.
Radagast does what Radagast wants.
There you go. Yeah, it's kind of funny how, like,
they spent about half hour discussing what this owl must be up to.
The omen.
Yeah,
the omen owl. Where is
it? Comes down to things fitting, and that's I think where the line needs to be. I mean, you want enough realism for it to make sense and to be consistent, but it doesn't have to be scientifically explainable. You know, the whole like magic finds a way. I mean, that is a great way to explain just about any idea. It's like, okay, what if you had a player character is like, I want to make a character who is like, you know, I don't know, half lizard man, half human, and you were down for the idea. I'm just throwing out an idea, spitballing, but all right, well, how did that happen? Magic.
No, an egg-laying creature and a live birth creature are not going to be able to mate. I don't care how much magic you throw into that.
Well, at the same time,
platypus.
I mean, at the same time, you know, we have folklore that supports such things where you have, you know, the human child born to the animal because the one of the parents shapeshifted into an animal, right. And you know
again, that's magic.
Exactly, the magic can be explained. I mean, and we have all sorts of things in D&D, for example, that are the product of a mad wizard. So, you know, if somebody came to me with that weird half lizard man character, first of all, what character race are you actually writing this up as? Maybe they use the stats for Yuan-Ti or something like that, right? You know, and if we're talking 5th edition or one of the 3rd edition ones where you had that option, but explain it to me. You know, is it divine intervention? Because that's the other thing. Besides magic, we have gods, and how all you have to do is look at Norse mythology or Greek mythology or any mythology, and you can see that
Loki,
all kinds of shenanigans can occur and produce whatever you want.
Yeah, Loki was out being a maniac in Norse mythology. I mean, he was sleeping with everything.
Well, yeah, you know, like Zeus is like, hey, I'm going to appear as some money, and things are going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, You know, if somebody came up to me, if I was getting ready to start a game, and one of the players came up to me with a really good background and a really good reason while they're wanting to play some kind of mixed race, I would probably be okay with it as long as they had a good reason why this character would be in this campaign.
Yeah, if they're just wanting to do it as a fluke, I'm probably not going to be down for it. Like I tend to run tieflings in my modern, my games as rarities, even though 5th edition talks about there's an entire nation or city of tieflings out there. I like the old 2nd edition, Planescape version where tieflings were the byproduct of off-handed. Oh wait, Shadow wants to come in here. I think I may have room.
Yeah,
I think you can
you
have
should have room for
6.
6 in
Yep,
total.
there we go. Hey, Shadow, welcome.
Hey,
Hello.
yeah,
Hey, what's
I
up,
run
guys?
I run Asimars in my campaign. If somebody wants to play Asimar, I mean, it's the opposite of a tiefling. I run a tiefling too if somebody really wants to play one, but have a good reason why you want to be this character.
Well, and the original tiefling description is so much better for that, because if you remember when tieflings were first presented in Planescape, they were not necessarily the byproducts of like demonic lineage. They could be the children of people who just spent too much time in the lower planes, and the energy of the planes affected the pregnancy.
Like they could be the lineage of two human. They could have two human parents.
Yeah, but they were they were traveling the planes and stuck in hell too long.
Yeah.
Or back in the
Is
day,
that
maybe one of their
sorry.
ancestors had a tryst with a demon or something, and it was a dormant gene in their thing.
But I still like that idea that the energies of the planes could affect that outcome. That's great, because it doesn't even necessarily require some kind of lineage, and that also then allows you to extend it to, I mean, the Azamar were originally presented with that same flip side, that you could have just maybe you spent a lot of time in the 7 heavens or whatever.
Is that 2nd edition lore?
Yeah, that's Planescape lore. That's when they first put in those weird extraplanar races, to go with that setting.
Actually, the Monster Manual 2, I think, had them as encounterable monsters, and I'm pretty sure they were usually,
well, in the Monster Manual, they had Alu demons and Cambions, which were actually half demons, male or female. They weren't. The Tieflings are slightly different. They're not as potent. So
right, and I think that was part of the Satanic Panic changeover from 1st to 2nd, and they tried to, tone things down for the upset mothers out there.
Yeah.
If you look, Squirrel, if you look into the lore of the hobgoblins, they are very regimented. They have a very regimented lawful evil society. So yeah, they will have like stronger warrior type leader hobgoblin knights leading the city and stuff like that. They do have a very structured society.
Yeah, it also is weird that they've almost always been depicted very East Asian in the artwork, very Chinese armor or Japanese armor. I think that kind
of. Sorry.
Oh no, good.
Has anyone ever noticed the similarity between their appearance and I forget what they were called in The Wizard of Oz, the OEO guys?
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about.
The guards, yeah.
That's always what I picture them as. Just a weird thing.
Well, originally I think hobgoblins were written into D&D to fill the space of the Uruk-hai, the more regimented, daylight able orc.
Yeah, they're wearing lamellar armor and stuff like the Asian whole motif. They're wearing lamellar armor.
Yeah,
a lot of times you see them with the helmet on. It's like
my previous comment?
Samurai helmet and stuff like that.
This one,
because I always thought that I always thought that the Uruk-hai were literally that Saruman took humans and mixed them in a in a sort of a Vancian vat or what have you to create the new, race of his troopers. Have any of you guys ever done something like this when it came to why half orcs existed, as opposed to the unlikely occurrence of a mixing of the races the natural way?
I haven't
Now,
done it, but
always-
it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes
Mine's
complete
always been-
sense.
yeah, mine's always been grape soda, man. If it's a half orc, 99% of the time somebody was looking for some grape soda.
But yeah, I think it's a great way to work it in a setting if you didn't want to make this species viable across the spectrum. Because even the the origin for the half elf in D&D, I think, is kind of Elrond. And and even in that case, and the others like him, it's not the same thing. Like, he was full on elf until he chose to be elf or man, and then his brother flipped the other way, right? And if I'm remembering my Tolkien right, but I have an encyclopedic knowledge of Tolkien. I've never read this stuff.
He chose immortality, didn't he? But Arwen chose mortality.
Yeah, and then
when they get a certain
Elros's
age,
brother.
Elrond's brother
Elrond's
also
brother,
chose
Elros.
mortality.
Yeah, like Elrond's sons. Elrond has two sons that really, any of the movies or stuff like that, they get written out. But they're like, they hang out with Aragorn all the time. I mean, they're Aragorn's
brothers. And in Tolkien's world, the half-elves get to make their choice.
Yeah, and those two chose to be human, or not human, but elves.
Yeah.
They're like, we're elves. Arwen chose to be human because she wanted to be with Aragorn. And I like that idea of in the Tolkien thing where elf chooses how he wants to be. But I don't ever bring that into my D&D game. If you're playing a half elf, you're following that trope right there. You're born a half elf, you live a half elf, you die a half elf.
It's a simple fact that it's rare for campaigns to be spread over a number of years for it to matter.
Yeah, it's like you got to choose whether you can decide in your character background whether you were raised by elves or you were raised by humans.
Unless you get hit with a lot of haste spells.
Yeah,
right.
Unless you lie.
Who actually runs a 500+ year long campaign with the same players? Unless you fast forward a lot of time throughout the process. I was talking to who was it? A friend of mine you guys don't know. He's not a YouTuber. George from Emperor's Choice. We were talking about how the current environment of newer gamers rarely make it through 6 or 8 game sessions before calling it quits and moving on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us old timers, we want the longer game, and even then, what's the likelihood that any current gamers have actually run without speeding up time a campaign that's 500 or 1,000 years, or in the case of the original Dungeon Master's Guide where gray elves live like 3,000 years. That's a crazy amount of time.
There's no way to run it without flash forwarding the time. Yeah.
Obviously. But I mean by big gaps. You can I've seen a year or 10 years, but like 100 years, you'd have to make 100-year jumps for it to
the closest we ever got was playing characters of a lineage. Like, I'm playing my previous character's son, and that's because my other character, we stopped that campaign and we're picking up another campaign. I go to the DM, I'm like, I want to play such and such's kid. Is that cool? He's like, yeah.
We've done that quite a few times where we've had campaigns going on so long that we're playing the squire of our original character, or the child of our original, or even the grandchild of our original character. And
here's a question for you guys. When you guys do that, if you allow someone to run somebody else's son, what kind of limitations do you put on their inheritance?
It depends on, you talk about it with the background, you talk about it with the DM, and is the father going to give, if the father's retired and this kid is taking over like the lifestyle, you would think that the father's going to give a lot of his stuff to the child. But if you're starting that guy off as like a first level, and that previous character had like +2, +3 armor, +2 or 3 sword, the kid's not going to get it. Yeah, I'm not going to let a first level character start out with a bunch of magical items.
Yeah, that's
Maybe
that's
the kid can get
that's above the hearth.
Yeah, maybe the kid can get or inherit the armor and stuff from the father or mother.
But that seems a little
as
gamey,
long as
doesn't it?
they have to prove themselves as an adventurer, prove that they have earned and deserved it.
I think
Yeah,
Might allow one
parent-
special item as an heirloom or something.
Yeah.
But what if
prized
the parent? What if the parent is literally the parents are dead? The kid inherits everything. Are you still going to try to game those limitations? No, you don't get the +5 armor that your father wore. That sort of thing.
You're not skilled enough to wear it. That's what I'm going to throw out there. You're not skilled
I totally
enough.
get the gamey part of it. But I've been in this situation multiple times where there was no justification other than DM fiat saying, no, I'm not giving it to you. Do you think most players are okay with that? Or would you try to write some sort of, trustee situation where there's someone, the court wizard is in charge of handing the stuff down as the character is ready, as opposed to just going, no, I'm not letting you have all your dad's stuff.
That's probably a good idea, having somebody put in charge of it, as the father would have left the will saying, so and so will oversee it, and as you prove yourself, as you prove your worth, such they are wise enough to grant you access to it as you move through each stage.
The king has declared that he is claiming your father's powerful
that's the other
items.
thing. It's like, what kind of inheritance taxes were placed on your father's adventuring gear?
I think contextually, Shadow, it depends. Like, okay, if you are playing the heir of your previous character, right? So your fighter character is human. He grows old. You've rolled up a new fighter. It's the son of your previous character, which is fine. In that case, because it's even a thing in D&D, you can will your stuff to other characters, and by all means, I'll take it. I'll allow it. I would even allow the XP, and you're starting with a boost.
I think the XP is one of the things that I would use to make the character understand that if he gets it now, you don't get the XP, but if you earn it, you get the XP. The reason I'm asking is, I'm a dad. I've got a 14-year-old son, and I'm not going to be around forever. And I own some things that are pretty valuable. Let's just put it that way. I also own more than a couple firearms. And I know that right off the bat, if I were to pass away, my son can't legally even own them. But when he's 21, would you hand over your Desert Eagle or your 308 or other things like that to your 21-year-old son? If you were, you're not here anymore, and would you put it in the will that when you're 21, you get all this, because otherwise, someone else is going to take it.
If you're doing it as an inheritance, like I have that situation. I have my grandmother's 38 Smith & Wesson revolver. It's my 17-year-old daughter's. She's 17. She owns it. It's hers.
I love the fact that it's your grandmother's. Yeah. My grandmother's firearm.
I got that. I gave it to my daughter. She also owns a long rifle. A parent can buy their children a firearm and give it to them, but they have to make sure that it's secure when the child's not using it. So, an underage child can own the firearm. So it's with the D&D scope. What I would do is I would tell the character, I was like, listen here, okay, yeah, you're the player. I was like, you're the son of this person, but your character, you're idolized his father. Your character don't think that he is worthy enough to use that stuff until he is
that's
proven
kind of telling
himself.
the player how they think, though. I know a lot
If
of
they
people.
want to play,
you can talk to the player. I think honestly that's a time to have a conversation with your player and really like, all right, frame this for me. How is it now? weighing in on it myself, I honestly, if somebody went through the trouble of playing a long campaign with a character with an illustrious history, and then they decided to play their character's heir, I might even allow them to start the game with all that nifty equipment. They're still a first level fighter, even if they may be wearing a suit of +3 plate. Yeah, and they've still got the same number of hit points. And this comment by Grumpy Old Slan actually brings up a good point. Do they have the stats to resist the ego of that intelligent sword that they're carrying around?
Exactly.
How did you cut his head off? Well, I didn't know it was loaded.
There is a mechanical way you could handle that too, if you expect that that's going to be a thing in your games,
Right,
and that
because
would be to use the family generator from Oriental Adventures, because the family generator will determine how many people are in the family, how big the family is, if the PC is the oldest and therefore the inheritor, and then if that's out of the way, they can still benefit from it, but they may not be the one who gets the prime cut of the inheritance. And then you can use that as a justifier, going, "Hey, look, you're only really worth an heirloom, maybe a +1 sword."
There are any number of ways to do it.
It happened literally in real game, where the players went to all of the processes to make sure that their previous character, while it was alive, went to great lengths to ensure the safety and well-being and continued power, of the previous character, because that's how it works in the real world. If you're a nobleman, or a king or something like that, you're going to do everything you can to make sure that when you're dead and your eldest son gets all of what it gets, that they're going to be well taken care of and well defended and well protected. That alone might actually eliminate their actual ability to go out and adventure. If you think about it, oh no, you just inherited the throne. You're not going adventuring. You're going to have to sneak out and do all this other stuff. You sure, you can give your new child all these neat things, but guess what? No one's letting you out of the castle without an armed bodyguard. Sure, you're walking around in +5 plate mail, but you're not doing anything with it. If an orc comes anywhere near you, it's getting shot down by your bodyguards. There's other ways. There's other ways to let the player get what they think they want, but then find out, without you actually, just saying no because you're ruining the game. Use the actual situation, the reality of the situation, to say, well, yeah, you're not going adventuring. You're a first level nobleman, and maybe it is actually his younger brother or sister that's actually going to be the one to really take up in their father's footsteps, and spring that on them, or let them know. It's like, sure, you got the oldest, he's going to be the spoiled rotten, gets everything, and then the other kids, they're going to be the ones who can literally go out and play in the game.
Yeah, it was like my last 5th edition fighter I played, and he was the youngest of 4 brothers, and so he got good schooling, he got some decent starting equipment, but he had to go out into the world to make his own name for himself, because he wasn't going to inherit anything.
I mean,
his grandfather, as his background, his grandfather paid for him to go to the best sword school, so he's a good swordsman.
You could also bring in, obviously, if your father was playing original AD&D, you've got a castle, you've got a realm, and people. The idea is you retire to run that realm, which requires visits from other nobles, and it requires you to be at certain functions and perform certain duties. You're not going to have time to adventure.
Yeah, if you want to have free access to the and the other thing is too, is if you want to have free access to the wealth of whatever holding it is, then you have to take the responsibilities on, and because all that treasure that was accumulated by your family, that's family wealth. I am going to have to actually put the stream end warning here because I'm actually a half an hour over my predicted time frame. So
that's life knocking you for making a comment about the length of John's streams.
that is true.
Yeah.
I am going.
Sorry, man.
I would appreciate you guys to come over to my stream next and say hello.
Yep.
I will try. I have to go make lunch.
Everybody's welcome on my stream.
Hey, I was doing dishes at the start of the stream. You can do two things at once.
Well, I may be listening. I may be lurking in the comments. But,
That's fine.
I do appreciate the turnout today, both in the chat and also, I finally decided to send out invites to folks, and it definitely paid off. Thanks for coming by. Hungar, great to have you here. Shadow, glad you finally made it to one of these.
Thank you. Yeah, that's why I wanted to come on, was to thank all you guys for being who you guys are lately. You guys have all, really just knocked it out of the park, showing the people out there in TV land what a nice little family, because I'm not going to use the C word, that we've got going on here. You all, thank you again for the PDFs. I'm going to try to get to them as soon as I get through the other stacks of things that are on my reading list. But I really appreciate it. All you guys.
Great. It is a good group, and I'm glad you're here. Mage's Musings, Geek, thank you for coming by. It's always great to talk with you guys. I may have to block out a longer block of time if I'm going to have guests. And the topic today, admittedly, was one that there's not too much specific information to talk to say, but
we were on point for a very good long time. So
yeah, it's not like when I did the superhero one, which was only a quick hour stream, but I feel like that one would have been a great chat. And Shadow has bugged me to do another superhero discussion, and I may have to block it out and do one. But I must.
You might have to do it under supervision. Yeah.
Oh, hey, a quick little tip for those of you guys who don't know, who are using the free StreamYard 20 hours a month. If you start a show with only an hour left, you can go on all day and nothing will happen. I mean, you'll get your show. And so take, really block and schedule, your time so that when your last show rolls around, you have only 5 minutes left, but you still do a 2-hour show.
So Shadow has proven he's not of lawful alignment there, I guess.
All right. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Have a great night, folks.
Yes.
Everybody, if you have a channel, shill it. So Shadow has a channel.
We've all
Mage
got
Music has a
channels.
channel.
We're
all channel guys here. Hungar's
We've
got a
all
channel.
got channels.
All right.
Come join all of us. We're all building.
Yes.
All right. Have a good night, folks.
All right. Good day, everyone.
Whichever time zone you're in. Later.
Thanks again, guys. Bye.
Bye.